Welcome to the University of Exeter Business School's celebration of International Women's Day. We've got a very lively discussion this afternoon featuring a lineup of senior women leaders from our region who will be considering the topic of women, business and the pandemic. My name is Ciara Eastell and I'm a Professor of Practice here at the Centre for Leadership in the Business School, and I'm your host for this afternoon's event. We'll be reflecting on the past year, how in this very challenging and extraordinary year, how girls and women, especially in our region, have been affected by the pandemic. And we'll be looking ahead and considering the important role that women can play in the recovery and reset agenda within our economy, our communities, and in wider civic life. And we'll be thinking about how, as women leaders, how we can use this moment to drive lasting and meaningful change in our organisation's approach to diversity and inclusion. Here at the Business School, our key strategic priorities are focused on responsible leadership, digital transformation and environmental sustainability, and we do that through our teaching and research. And we're keen to connect with all of you, our students, our staff, our alumni, our fellows, and our wider stakeholder and business community, especially at this time. And we'll be running a number of events, including a series of women in business events. So do please look out for those events. So on to our panel this afternoon. I'm delighted to introduce you to our speakers, and I'm just going to introduce them in turn. Sarah Abrahams has a long and successful career in the financial services sector, and she's here this afternoon representing the Inspiring Girls Initiative, a project she founded just before the pandemic here in Exeter. Sarah's worked in collaboration with Exeter City Council and with the Heart of the South West Careers Hub to create a programme designed to inspire curiosity and to get more young women into careers and jobs that they might not ordinarily think about. I have to say that I've been a mentor for one local girl in recent months, and it's been one of the most enjoyable and rewarding things I've done this past year. Sawsan Khuri is an innovation specialist with a background in science and tech. She's happiest when creating synergies and empowering the young. Sawsan runs collaborative capacities focused on delivering collaborative innovation transformations for small and medium-sized businesses and research organisations, and is the co-founder of Advance Youth Now, a startup for mentoring teens in entrepreneurship. Good topic for Sarah too. In addition, Sawsan contributes to science education as a part-time lecturer here at the University of Exeter in the College of Medicine and Health. Clodagh Raddon is our third panellist. Originally from Ireland, Clodagh started her career in San Francisco before moving back to the UK in 2003. And over the past 25 years, she's led both large and small business transformation in the digital and IT sectors. Clodagh set up her own new business this past year, Larks Live, during the pandemic, and also took on the role of chair of Exeter Chamber of Commerce, so a busy few months for Clodagh. And she also sits on the Business School's International External Advisory Board. Ruth Sealy is Associate Professor and Director of Impact here at the Business School, with global academic expertise on women on corporate boards. Ruth's research areas include women in leadership, board composition, role models, and various aspects of corporate governance. And she was the lead researcher of the annual Female FTSE report, monitoring women on listed boards and executive committees. Ruth is a member of the NHS Advisory Board and has worked extensively across the NHS, monitoring the gender composition of NHS boards. And in recognition of her work, she was named last year of one of People Management's Diversity and Inclusion Power List. Finally, Melanie Walker, MBE, is Chief Executive of Devon Partnership Trust. A nurse by background, Melanie has worked at all levels and in all settings across the NHS and has a long history of working in mental health services. Melanie is a trustee and board member of NHS providers representing mental health trusts across the country, and is also chair of DYS Space, the charity that runs youth services across Devon. So I'm sure you'll agree, a really inspiring panel for our event today. So we have three key questions which I'll invite our panel to discuss during our time together this afternoon. Firstly, What has been the impact of the pandemic on girls and women, particularly in our region? Second question, what role and contribution should women in our region be playing in the plans to rebuild and reshape our economy and wider society over the next few years? And finally, how can we make sure that we seize this moment to build a more diverse and inclusive approach to developing our businesses and our institutions in the future? In terms of format, I'll ask two of our panelists to kick off the discussion on each question, and then we'll open up each question to the whole panel for their views. The theme of this year's International Women's Day is Choose to Challenge. So I'm encouraging all of our panelists to choose to challenge themselves and each other so we have a lively and engaged discussion. And if you'd like to be part of it too, do please pop your thoughts and questions into the chat directed to me. We are recording this session so that we can share it with students who are unable to join us due to their academic commitments. So, without further ado, I'm going to ask Melanie and Clodagh to kick us off with that first question. So, Melanie, you first. From your perspective, particularly with your NHS hat on, but also your DYS space hat on, can you give us your perspective on how the pandemic has affected girls and women in our region?
Thanks, Ciara, and happy International Women's Day, everyone. So when I was thinking about the discussion today, quite a lot of thoughts came to my head, and it wasn't that surprising, I suppose, that my experience of it having such an NHS focus during the pandemic has been that mainly about frontline staff. And when you and patients, and when actually you think about that, you begin to move very quickly into some of the inequality that occurs within the NHS, but actually more widely in the care sectors and the public sector. And so it wasn't that surprising. And I sort of got a slide earlier this morning, actually, which I'm just going to ask Charlotte to cast for me, which showed in the stark reality of some of that issue. So this is the case rate of the population by age band. So youngest, so the bottom one is 0 to 4, the top is 90 plus. The red is for women, the blue is for men. And quite simply, you can see that the physical burden of catching COVID is significantly more for women than men. And you can stop sharing now, Charlotte, thank you. So the specific of that we can unpick, and that's just one slide, but that actually takes us into a discussion about what that means. So why do women have a higher case rate? And the reason is multiple. It is because actually more frontline carers, whether they're NHS carers or social carers or teaching staff and those other key worker roles such as retail, are primarily the work of women. And so, not surprisingly, they're therefore more exposed to COVID, and therefore they're more likely to catch COVID. And I thought it was very interesting, given as the profile of how we have given vaccinations, for example, hasn't been gender differentiated at all. It's been age differentiated. So that was really interesting. And when you also think about what we know about the impact, the differential impact of COVID on people from Black, Asian or other minority ethnic backgrounds, then too we haven't differentiated that for women or men in those groups. So a very interesting position, and I wonder why we haven't done that. I wonder why we find some of those discussions not even difficult to have. I don't think the discussions even occurred to people, and to be frank, until I saw that slide this morning, I had no idea it was that stark. Well, given, so I didn't, and I can't pretend that I did. So that then got me on to thinking about, given the theme is choose to challenge, I wonder why we didn't challenge that. I wonder why that becomes almost too difficult to bring to the front of our minds as a society, but certainly as women leaders. And I was very minded about the way that the discussion about the impact of COVID in the country has been framed. And what we know is that it is not, it is not, there are very few issues that are COVID specific. What has happened is the inequality in the country and internationally has been exacerbated and emphasised by COVID. And I think then you roll out, and I'm sure lots of things that people talk about today, you then, once you clock that, you realise that actually the inequalities that women face around work, around not the type of work, but the tenure of work, the need to address childcare in a different way than in the main men do, and actually perhaps even more the access to digital means of support, the access to income and therefore the poverty differential, all of those things for women were just exacerbated and emphasised, not all exacerbated, but definitely all emphasised. So that then took me to another discussion, which was in my head. So, just because there was nobody else to talk to at the time, but that's actually, I'm very glad to listen to all of you. But another bit that really looped me right back to actually the male construct of our world absolutely exacerbates the inequality and that we have, the gender inequalities, but also many, many other inequalities. That until we address that fundamental systemic inequality that is dominated by a very stereotypical white middle-class male construct, until we begin to really drive into that. And I would suggest that our challenge now as women, and many of us in this group are women who have managed to get to where we are despite those barriers, and have had opportunities and taken opportunities that many women don't ever have, or indeed people with other disadvantage or inequality, that actually if we choose to challenge, then we have to choose to challenge the male construct of work, of care, of income, of the structure of society, because otherwise we will always be pushing against rather than driving the flow through. And I'll finish by thinking, so there's been a lot of discussion about why have women governmental leaders been successful, whereas male governmental leaders haven't been in the time of the pandemic. And I just put a challenge back to us, as I personally see that as a rather simplistic discussion. I think you need to get under what are the actions that those women or those men took, and why is it easier to say women do this, men do that, rather than actually allowing men to be good men and allowing women to be bad women. And actually, how do we move that discussion on to a different level of sophistication? Because it cannot be right. That slide that I showed cannot be right. It cannot be right that women in the care groups, and if you look at the age band of those care groups, those gender groups, if you absolutely look at those, it is women who are working, who are of childbearing age, and therefore we can assume have higher levels of childcare responsibilities, who have carried the burden of COVID. So I'll finish there, Ciara, and pass on. Thank you.
Thanks, Melanie. That's a great opener. Yes, over to you, Clodagh, from your...
Yeah, no, Melanie, that's incredibly thought-provoking. There's quite a lot in that, and it's an amazingly interesting slide in terms of and unpacking the why are men and why are women, and actually I think you're right, it is too simplistic. I think there's a whole host to unpack in that. From a business perspective, watching particularly around the region, and it is in some ways technology is brilliant because you can get out of your room and get to different parts of the world through Zoom or Teams or whatever. But in other ways, we are very centred and very focused on Exeter and the region here, and that's what I've spent most of my time, or in fact all of my time over the last 12 months, working with and supporting businesses. And it's been really interesting and quite scary in some ways to watch the burden that has fallen on the girls and the women, as they have in a lot of ways taken, if they're running or supporting running businesses or running businesses with their partners, the lion's share of the burden has fallen to the women to get the plans in place to help diversify, redress, deal with, then homeschooling on top of that, and all of the other a lot of the other care that goes into looking after the home. It's been quite interesting to be on regular discussions with peers who are working and who are managing and who are supporting, and hear the stories and the tales of what is actually going on, and the level of angst and I wouldn't say anxiety. There's anxiety across the entire pandemic, but I think we all have that, men and women. But just I think the burden share that actually the girls have felt throughout this in terms of what they need to do, the number of balls that we as girls are juggling day in and day out, and in some cases, to some extent, helping to prop up some of the guys who are out there. So some of the organisations I'm involved with throughout the pandemic, from when we started getting really engaged with this in April, May timeframe, actually it has been a cohort of females who have led all of that activity. We've been the ones that are regularly on the calls, once a week for one set of organisations and once a fortnight for another set of organisations. And predominantly it is 4 or 8 or 6 girls every single week on these calls, helping to support the wider business community in our region. And in a lot of cases, the guys are off doing, the stuff that in terms of running their business, but haven't fundamentally made the time to do the wider role that they signed up to when they became members of these organisations. So I think in terms of choosing to challenge, I think that status quo is something that we need to challenge and say, actually, this isn't good enough. And I prefer working in teams where there's really good diversity, because actually I just get a lot more energy out of that. But I have found that it's been very tilted towards actually girls rolling their sleeves up and getting stuck in, and supporting each other, business to business, supporting each other, human to human, girl to girl, and certainly working collaboratively for the greater good of the region. And that's the other thing I have seen is a huge amount of collaboration, a huge amount of support. And I think, in terms of taking something out of this and driving it forward, I think there is without a shadow of a doubt something that we need to grasp that and make sure that we build on it in a really positive way, because we can be supportive of each other and help each other, and that's an incredibly good thing to do. But certainly what I've seen across businesses, I would say that 80-90% of the business owners I'm talking to are fundamentally exhausted at this point. There is light at the end of the tunnel because we've now got dates that we can work to. So the uncertainty is disappearing. For a whole host of women in business, today is a big day where they've been child schooling, they've been homeschooling. But there's also a whole host of people out there who haven't been homeschooling, and actually they are just as exhausted. So while some of us have actually got a big release, I mean, my 3 children skipped off to school this morning and I was thrilled to see them go, and we've had a quiet house all day and it's been blissful. But I talked to 3 other colleagues out there, and they haven't got children who've gone off to school today, and actually their week is the same as last week, whereas we had a bit of a lift today. So there's a whole host of people out there who haven't had that lift, who are girls who are fundamentally just trying to aim for the next date, and who are working, as we all are, in a room in an office, or in a room in a house, in a spare bedroom, or wherever it might be. And our ability as business leaders to share, collaborate, get energy off each other because we're out having a cup of coffee, or we're having a walk, or we're doing this stuff, actually has disappeared. And that's made it considerably harder for women in business out there to actually navigate their way through this, so that the usual social bubbles that you might have to be able to bounce ideas or to be able to bounce woes actually have disappeared as well. So I think to a large extent, that big element of the support network for women in business has also played a big impact in terms of how we've adjusted. I'll end with a slight positive, which is I do think we've demonstrated how resilient we are. And I do honestly believe that when we come through this, and I look at the flowers coming up and the daffodils and all of that coming through, I do genuinely believe that as we come through this, we will be fundamentally 10 times better for it, because actually we are resilient. We can get things done. I think from a confidence perspective, the bunch of women I've worked with in the last year, our confidence as individuals, as a team, and as a group of people, and what we can do to positively enhance the situation and to positively influence and help others, actually means our confidence in our own ability and our ability to work together for the greater good has actually grown. So I do believe that we will come through this incredibly in a much better place. But within that, we need to make sure we don't lose this good as we come out to the new normal. And with that, I'll hand back to you, Ciara.
Thanks, Clodagh. I really like those final points. I totally agree. There's something about spring and this sort of sense of some kind of hope that's bringing that, yeah, and hopefully a bit of respite for people who genuinely, we see it all over, don't we? People who are absolutely on their knees and exhausted. Yeah, thank you both for kicking us off. So I'm going to invite the rest of the panel who might want to add, give different perspectives, challenge, offer alternatives to what's been happening for our girls and our women during the pandemic.
I think I'd just like to pick up on a point, Melanie, that you made around this real systemic issue that we've got with this middle class white male decision making. And there's a couple of things that were quite alarming for me, which really show how systemic it is. One being the fact that with the gender pay gap last year, the government announced that people didn't have to businesses didn't have to declare their gender pay gap last year, and that resulted in only half of companies deciding to do so, which is concerning, which shows actually what do businesses feel the value of that actually is. I think the second thing you could arguably say would be comical if it wasn't so concerning, which is probably the infamous stay at home and save lives poster. I don't know whether any of you remember when it first came out, and there was sort of 4 households depicted. 3 of the household had women holding babies, doing homeschooling and doing the chores, and the 4th household had a man relaxing on a sofa. And that was obviously very swiftly taken away. But that's really concerning, that the messaging, the subliminal messaging and the sort of the unconscious bias is absolutely rife. And that's really quite concerning, which really echoes the point that you were making.
Thanks, Sarah. It's hard to imagine how that piece of publicity got anywhere close to going live, which shows something, doesn't it? Sawsan or Ruth, anything to add?
I resonated with a lot of what Melanie, Clodagh and Sarah said, and it reminded me of a talk some months ago by Dame Minouche Shafik, who's the director at London School of Economics. She's just written a book. She's been talking about this for the last 3 or 4 years, but she's just published a book about the need for a new social contract. And it touched upon what Melanie was talking about. We need a new construct. She's calling it a contract. And the beginning of her talk, she was describing the conditions that brought out the current social contract, where, as Melanie was describing, certain jobs are still seen as female. And as Sarah said, there are still this subliminal bias at the back of the mind that there are, things that women do in the house and men take the garbage out and we say please, and all that kind of stuff. And she started out by describing the conditions under which the current social contracts were brought about. And they're at best 70 to 150 years old, these things. And the world we're living in now is so different, and we really do need to challenge all of us and ourselves and the world to kind of really take on a new social contract in terms of what we can bring to the conversation, how to harness our talents without, taking 60% of our time for things that, can be shared. So I think that resonates a lot with what we were saying, and she might, she will have more to say, obviously, but that really struck me, that maybe this is the grand challenge of today, this new social contract. The second thing I wanted to say is very much, again, in line with what everybody else has said. There is a theory, and some people like it, some people don't. I'm not making a value judgment about this theory, but there is a theory that women are better at tend and befriend. So when in times of crisis, we come together, we look after each other, we look after those that need looking after instinctively. Again, this is because grandmothers ago, this is how we are brought up to do. But then the next thing that happens is we begin making support networks at every level, not just in business. And several women I spoke with the last week or so have really summarized beautifully to me the value of these social networks that women are very good at making for each other. And so I have, colleagues and peers who have formed running groups, and they run together, they run separately, but maybe they're on the earphones with each other as they're doing this, or they have, they meet up for gin and tonics on Friday nights and just kind of chat about their woes and share recipes. And I think this is something that has been underestimated in employee engagement. So we talk about it as, oh yes, she's got her friends and she's doing the stuff with her friends. But actually, shouldn't we be bringing these things into the workplace and making them part of employee engagement? Shouldn't these things be part of, business resilience to create these networks that obviously work for people? So it's a new social contract, and it's the tend and befriend idea that we are better at doing than others.
And I think that speaks to Clodagh's point, Sawsan, doesn't it, about that sort of naturally collaborative, forging new kind of networks in order to support one another and to support one another's business.
Yeah, absolutely. It also speaks to Melanie's point about the new social construct. This is part of that. And Sarah's point about the subliminal messaging, because we are expected to connect with each other and engage and sort of Twitter with a small t away to each other and giggle and make things fun. But hey, there's a world out there. So again, why doesn't this become part of that new construct, new social contract that we can inform?
I just want to very briefly pick up on Melanie's point about the lack of sex disaggregated data that perhaps we've been being fed over the last year. And I think for me, this has been a long-term problem, that an awful lot of the data, and I would say this being an academic, that we deal with in our daily lives is often sex disaggregated. And there's a fantastic book, I'm sure many of you know about it, called Invisible Women by Caroline Criado Perez, which just lists incident after incident where we have been going through lives thinking that things are designed for us, the whole human population, whereas actually they've been designed for half of the human population. So, I think for me, that's always something that we need to pay attention to whenever we are fed a data point, is to be aware of who is this data taking into account. And, unfortunately, I think this was beautifully horrifically demonstrated last year with the algorithms around the GCSEs and A-levels, about how, that wasn't a gender thing, but it was a social divide, which was just going to be exacerbated. And so we really need to be careful as we reconstruct business based on the data and information that we have over the last year or so, to make sure that we really understand this data, because as our world becomes more digitized and as algorithms become more commonplace in ways that we often don't know about, it's just so key that we ensure that everything is looked at. What is the gender impact of this algorithm, for example, or this policy or this idea, and is it based on data?
Ruth, could you just speak to Sarah's point there around the gender pay gap data? So there was no obligation to collect it last year, which in some ways pragmatically was understandable, another kind of activity for hard pressed businesses. Can you give a perspective on what you think the impact of that may be?
Yes, I mean, I think Sarah put it beautifully. Unfortunately, what it does is devalue that data. And I think I don't know what the proportion who did present their data last year, if it was 50%, but partly that was probably because actually they didn't cancel it until right up close to the deadline. The deadline is the 31st of March, so one can imagine that maybe it was only a week or two before that the government said, okay, pax on that. And my understanding that this year, as we approached March, the figures were incredibly low. I think, and don't quote me on this, but I think initially there was a sense that we weren't going to have to declare it this year either, but I think now they have just pushed the deadline back. But what it does is it just sends the message that this is not important. We've got all sorts of these other important things to deal with, and gender pay gap reporting is not important, and therefore can slip off the bottom, which I think is an absolute disaster. And if we're going to take that approach to anything to do with gender or diversity, it's just a nice to have. It's completely the wrong approach. We're not talking about nice to haves here. We're talking about things that are utterly crucial to our effectiveness as a nation, as a business, as an organisation, that we take these things into account and have to adhere when there are rules.
Thank you, Ruth. That's really, really helpful. We can see which side of the argument you stand on.
She's not on her own. I mean, I think and a lot of these businesses actually will be businesses that will have people working from home, that it would have been their HR departments or legal departments, some of the teams pulling it together. It would not have been a big burden to do it. It was just wrong. It was wrong, and it sends the wrong message everywhere.
And I suppose it's a bit of a call to arms at this point as well, isn't it? That if there are a number of women in decision-making positions, that's the choose to challenge piece, isn't it? A bit like you were saying, Melanie, about some of the data and how it's sort of shared, and I think that we need to do more of that challenge if we're in those positions of power. So I think,
Melanie, can I just sort of ask you to just kind of give us a sense in terms of the mental health impact on girls and women over the past year, and what you've seen? We all know from everything that we've watched that this is a major issue and will continue to be. But what particular gender aspects of that do you see?
So we know anyway that in terms of mental health impact, that women are more likely to, this is not a technical term, but introvert their mental health challenges and their anxiety. So depression and anxiety is much more common in women. But what we also know is that women, and young women in particular, are more likely to self-harm as a consequence of an expression of their distress. And we know that actually the Southwest has particularly high levels of that. And we know those levels have increased. It's too soon to be able to tell us, and we do actually collect that by gender, but interestingly it doesn't get published by gender. We have to it's quite easy to get down to, but the ask isn't for us to publish it by gender. But so that is already a problem in the Southwest and has been exacerbated by the pandemic, and it is particularly so in young women. And by young women, I mean those from about 14 to about 25. So it crosses the young people into adult age band. And we also know that eating disorders and disordered eating, which ends up in quite a technical split, but people who struggle to eat in a way that we would think was healthy and normal, if I can use that word, that has become exceptionally exacerbated. So it's not unique to women and girls, but it's definitely a much, much bigger issue, and all of that has got a lot worse. The other bit we know, and I think this is ties in with some of the earlier conversation, is that for women who are victims of domestic violence, 1 in 3 suicides are because those women have been the victims of domestic violence. We know that domestic violence has increased during the pandemic and is likely to continue as the pressure of recession and recovery, slow recovery, carries on. And the women again carry the burden of that. So the burden of that in all sorts of ways, and so the ending of life, suicide is only one measure of that, but that is huge. And again, the Southwest is an outlier for suicide rates in men and women, actually a bit more in men than women, but nevertheless an outlier. So we know that the data hasn't come because it's very small numbers. Each one is a very awful event and has a massive ramification, but we know that that is coming through now. The other bits then are that actually We know prescribing of antidepressants is much, much higher in women. It's higher in women appropriately, it's higher in women inappropriately too, so that women are medicated rather than offered counselling sometime, and those resources are hard to find. So we provide, as every NHS every part of the NHS has across the country, talking therapies. Those have become digital to cope with the pandemic, and for many people that's been really helpful, because they've been but actually certainly for some people they have had to say, I can't do that because I'm in a home or an environment where that would become obvious and I can't carry that risk. So I think the burden for I think the mental health burden on society is huge, and we touched on that right at the beginning, didn't we? But for women and young women, most particularly, it is profound, and I wonder how we will recover from that. And some of that is not recoverable. So if we think about the impact for women of domestic violence, we know that there's an impact for them, but also obviously their family, and those children's life chances are blighted. If a mother or a father, but if a mother takes her own life, then those children, and I say fathers, well, their life chances are blighted. So this isn't a short-term issue. This is a generational issue. And Ruth talked about the impact on children and young people around GCSEs. Again, we know the uptake of our support services for young people through our children and adolescent mental health services has shot. That's the area we've seen the biggest growth. We've seen at least 20% increase in referrals, and we offer all sorts of things, but even just the informal, actually have a look here, see, there's some help here, has picked up, and we know we'll only be scraping the surface. Mm-hmm. And I, in our sort of a vested interest, I have a teenage son. He was one of the GCSE generation, and he's now in low sick, going back to school on Thursday. I do wonder what that means for those young people going forward. And certainly, and again, I'm dealing in anecdote now, but two of my friends who have children of the same age, their daughters have developed an eating disorder during lockdown, which they had no indication of before, and their anxiety about school, returning to school, what it means to have missed schooling. And I do wonder what next year's GCSE and A-level programmes will be, and what it means for all of them as they progress through work or university or whatever their life choices are, and how we support them. But again, it's undoubtedly had a massive impact on the whole population, and where that burden lies varies a bit. If you look in things like substance misuse and alcohol use, it's more even between men and women, but definitely in self-harm and depression, anxiety, it sits with them.
Thanks, Melanie. It just reminds me, on a more positive note, before I move us on to the second question, about the Inspiring Girls initiative, Sarah. And I know you conceived of this prior to the pandemic, but perhaps you could just tell us a bit about what Inspiring Girls is and how it's been operating during the pandemic and what impact you've seen so far.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that, as you say, Ciara, the concept was born out of probably more of our third question, which is about the diversity and inclusion within our society, and particularly in the workplace. And actually, through doing some research, identifying that young girls make choices really early on around careers, moreover that they deselect based on gender, but the positives around the injection of role models into some of the these young girls can make a huge difference. And I think that when the pandemic hit, it was right at the beginning of us reaching out to women across the region to see whether there was going to be any responders to help some of these girls, completely overwhelmed by the response. But originally, obviously from our schooling perspective, it was going to be very much face-to-face mentoring opportunities. So very quickly having to adapt to doing that with the schools, and they have been fantastic to be able to do that virtually, which has been great as a learning experience for the girls as well as a lot of the business women. But I think that it, you know, what we've seen is a real myriad of the way that some girls are responding to than others, which probably echoes the point, Melanie, around some young females being really affected. It was so important for us to not wait until that face-to-face opportunity, because actually those moments of hours with somebody, building a relationship, somebody different, and having a role model for some of these girls has been hugely important. And as Ciara said at the beginning, it's been really valuable as a mentor as well, to connect with these young women who, I have to say, a number of them are really displaying huge signs of resilience with what they're dealing with as well, which is really positive. So yeah, so I think it's been fantastic to be able to kick it off, and hopefully it will have many years to come, and certainly with the support.
Thanks, Sarah. So I'm going to move us on. I mean, there's so much in everything that you've all said so far, but there's opportunities to carry that conversation on in our other two questions. But essentially, we were just looking back there, and I now want us to kind of look to the future. And you know, as Clodagh was saying before, you know, there is a bit of a sense of hope and optimism. None of us would want to overstate that, but you know, it is spring. We are a year on. We've adapted, and we may be emerging out of this, and we're beginning to think, and the language is beginning to frame around the reset, recovery, rebuild, however you want to frame that. And you know, clearly women in business, women in civic life, girls and women have got a massive contribution to play. So my second question then is, what is the role and contribution that girls and women in our region should be playing and can be playing to rebuild and reshape economies, communities, our wider civic life over the next few years? So Sawsan, I'm going to ask you to kick us off on that question.
Thank you, Ciara. What a question. I think I'd like to start by saying that one of the good things that's come out from COVID is how closer the world is, because here we are on Zoom, and I really could be in Scotland. I could equally be in, you know, Venezuela. I mean, it doesn't really matter where we are anymore. And I think for this region, we can very much try and model the new normal that we want to see. I'm one of those that believes that the old normal is gone and we're never going to see it again. And in some ways, thank goodness for that. And I'd like us to go forward with what we've learned and what we have accomplished in being able to do all the work that we have done and all the community building that we have been able to do with the technologies that we are so lucky to have, and take that through into the wider scheme of things. So instead of waiting for, you know, policy A, B, or C to happen, let's bring it here. Let's make it happen from the Southwest. Let us be the role models for how we want the country to then progress. Why not? We can. We're here. And there's everything under our fingertips to be able to make this happen. So when we talk about this new social construct or contract or whatever you want to call it, let's make it happen. Let's reach out to businesses that we know are around us and say, look, what do you think about this? You can increase your employee engagement. You can increase decrease your gender pay gap. You can, you know, these are the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things that will happen if we try to innovate together, how we can build a better future forward. And I think I like the word choose to challenge, but at the same time, I prefer the word choose to grab the opportunity, because here is what we have now. We have an opportunity to really create something new, to collaborate together, men and women and old and young and ethnic minorities and everybody together. We have this opportunity. We have the know-how. We have the will to kind of bring a new normal. all that remains is for us to put our heads together and make it happen. And I think we are wasting an opportunity if we sit back and wait for policy A, B, and C to run after us, when we can do it from Devon and the Southwest and Cornwall and Dorset and Somerset and Bristol. I'm sure I'm going to forget somebody in the Southwest, but we can do it here. And we have the sizes of businesses, big and small, to be able to bring in these new innovative, creative ways and become the role models that then we can, kind of inform what happens next. I'd like to bring in two other points if I still have time. The one is I'd like us also here. I'd like to see us here in Devon and the Southwest. So I'm going to say Devon because I live in Devon, okay? But let's say the Southwest, okay? I'd like us to really. I love the word role model, and I think it's used in such a small context. We tend to think of a role model as being a person, but we can think of role models as being a system that we like to emulate. We can think of role models as being New Zealand and what we'd like to do with it. So why don't we open up that idea that we have? And so one of these things that's in my head is role modeling entrepreneurship. So not necessarily entrepreneurs, but entrepreneurship, and that entrepreneurial mindset that we're not afraid to try something new. What's the worst that can happen? Oh dear, we have to tweak it because it doesn't quite work. Big deal. Tweak it and let's see what happens. Marvelous things happen from mistakes. So we really do need to kind of embrace that entrepreneurial mindset and see ourselves moving forward with it. One of the things that I've been preaching before and after COVID is that entrepreneurship is for everyone. Everybody can be entrepreneurial. You can be entrepreneurial within your big corporation, and that's called intrapreneurship. Fine. It has a name. It has a label. Fine. But it's bringing in that creativity that don't be afraid to test it out and what's the worst that can happen. So I do think that there's a lot we can play with in this space, and we here in the Southwest, I think, are ideally placed to have a go and again be those role models, whether it's for the new social contract, whether it's for how we define entrepreneurship for the world at large, and why not? And the second thing the third rather point that I wanted to make is that and it was something that I actually thought about when Melanie said the ask wasn't to make the numbers available by gender. So you have the data about mental health, but the ask wasn't to take out that spreadsheet and sort it by gender. Maybe you don't even have gender information on that spreadsheet because maybe the ask wasn't to collect it. Yeah. Ooh. So moving from that made me think of inclusion and the conversations we are currently having around whether it's DICE or EDI or many other acronyms that people are using around equality, diversity, inclusion, access, and so on. And I think we had made the mistake in the past of putting it into ethnic, gender, and these again are boxes. Now, I don't like boxes. I am ethnic, I am woman, I am mother, I am wife, I am this crazy individual who just speaks and likes to change things around me, and so does Clodagh, and so does Melanie, and so does Sarah, and so does Ruth, and so does Ciara. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here doing this. So let's take that inclusion of everything we are and bring it to the table again to inform that role model, whatever thing we want to have. Again, I think Southwest can do it, and we should be doing it for ourselves, for our region, and then ultimately maybe for the world. Who cares? I mean, I love the fact that it's an SME in Devon that made one of the widgets that went on the parachute to Mars. Hey, people, we are here to do this, and so let's do it. So that's that's the social construct. Let's make it happen. There's entrepreneurial. Why not? and there's role models and inclusion. It's all here for us to do. We just have to kind of, come together, collaborate, and move forward, rather than wait for something else to happen or someone to tell us to do it.
Thanks, Sawsan. Your energy is totally compelling, and I just feel that everybody that's on this call is kind of right behind you. Why not? Sarah, I'm just going to ask you to follow up on that.
Sure. I think when I was considering the question, I think the first thing that sprung to mind was sort of the initial recovery, where women will play quite a key role. There's in sort of not such a positive perspective, there will be collective grief and mourning, and that not only being through the sad loss of losing loved ones, but also from a financial security aspect, people losing their jobs, and lives being completely turned upside down. So there is a high percentage of women who are in that sort of community support role that's going to come to the fore. And obviously, Melanie, you talked about the sort of the mental health impact and challenges, which are also facing people initially. So in answer to the question from that perspective, that's definitely going to be a responsibility that women will bear a lot of that, to try and help people get back into a space where they can contribute fully to our region and to society. So huge hats off to those people who are going to be doing that in a very difficult time, and probably dealing with difficult things themselves. I think when I look sort of slightly more longer term, there is this, I'm reading a lot in the press at the moment around, and rightly so, the concerns about it spinning us back to the 1970s. Considering that sort of when I was about 2 or 3, that my mother wouldn't have been able to get a mortgage on her own is quite terrifying, that would have been in my lifetime. I suppose when I read elements like that, articles like that, I have to really consider this debate about almost setting the factory reset button. And are we really in that space? Because how much have we learnt over those 50 years that we can take with us now to make sure that really doesn't happen going forward? So we have tried and tested a number of things as pioneering women to break through some of those barriers, albeit not as fast as any of us would want. But there are some sort of processes that we've been through that we can mirror, and we can go, actually, we need more of this. So to Sawsan's point, that we are really have the ability to make that choice. There's probably two sort of parts of sort of the business world really that I think that potentially could have a different approach. So when I look at people within business, so where I'm working, we have started to talk about a hybrid way of working, people making choices how they would like to work. There's going to be less requirement for people to travel. Now, I've traveled with every role I've done, and I have thoroughly enjoyed the last 12 months to be able to be home and not traveling. And actually, I've been hugely more productive in that time as well. So I think there's a real opportunity to grasp that, where we have sort of the tech setup, the broadband, etc., and all the facilities that we need, but not every woman is in that type of role. That would mean that that's an opportunity. So we have a number of women who have been hugely impacted by working, they're in part-time work or low-paid work, which has meant that they've been more likely to be on furlough. We have 140,000 more women on furlough than men across the UK. And for those women, I think we need to consider what's the future. So hence why part of the reason I set up Inspiring Girls, because some of those women probably didn't have such wide choices or didn't consider that they had wide choices. Now, for us to be able to really break those barriers down for the future, we need to start with the young girls now. Now, there's been some real positives from those two groups, that for those women at home, Clodagh, you mentioned it, that resilience. I know that my children didn't really see how I worked before. They didn't see how many plates I was juggling. They now really understand, probably because many a time I've told them, but they really understand some of those challenges that working people, to be fair, a lot of people, rather than just it being specifically women, face. And I think that has helped role model to them the adaptability, the resilience. And I've seen my kids do fantastically actually with their homeschooling, that I was not quite sure how they would react to it. So, from a personal perspective, it's been a positive experience for them. But for those young people who maybe don't have role models, I think that's where we can really consider what is our sort of social responsibility to try and build those networks of role models to enable more and more young people to have the connectivity to different people. And particularly, when we consider the Southwest, more of the our economy is based in sort of retail, wholesale, and probably in sectors that have been hugely impacted, to be fair, from the pandemic. So, obviously leisure, tourism, and yet other industries like tech have been booming. They have less women in them. So that's so important for us to broaden the choices now at a young age, so that spin forward 10, 15 years, there are more choices of young girls that are actively going, I'm going to apply for that position, and then they're successful. And I think that's the role that a lot of business women within the region can play in that recovery as well. Thank you.
Sarah. We've got a whole splurge of great questions that have come in actually, and on this theme. So I'm just going to ask a couple of them, so that kind of frames the discussion for the rest of this question. So a couple of questions around the role of men in these gender discussions. So somebody asking, how could we more fully involve men in gender discussions and engage them with the changes we want to see? So a couple of questions along those lines. And then another good question, which is around, well, what are the very practical, specific things that actually in this kind of recovery and reset that we should be doing in terms of resetting the way that we work and behave together? So I'll just kind of give those couple of questions for now. I don't know who'd like to respond to either of those. Ruth?
Yeah, I think that's a great question about what's the role of men in all this, just simply because I think we always need to recognize this is not a women's problem. It's not for women to fix. This is a human problem for all of us to address. And I think one of the things around this recognition of the enormity of the domestic burden that oftentimes falls more heavily on women, it is that it has been recognized, perhaps more so than at other times. So certainly I think there's a lot of record around men, because men and women are working at home together, that the men see how much more domestic labor that there is that they are not doing. And I think one of the problems that we have to address at a societal level is just this age-old issue around gender roles and gender stereotypes. And why is it when you have two people working at home, both working full time, that one of them does 70% of the laundry or the cooking or the cleaning or whatever it is? And I think at an individual level, I think some of those conversations have been happening, but it needs to happen much more at a societal level. And to Sarah's point earlier about the horrific poster that came out, I do think we have to seriously push that further forward. I was reflecting this morning, it shows my age a little bit, but I remember Anyone remember the Smash adverts for instant mashed potato? And I remember at the time as a young girl being super impressed that the advert was a woman calling her husband at home saying, "You can put the dinner on, I'll be home in 20 minutes. Why I remember that, I don't know. But anyway, it made a big impression. But I think when you look at some of the adverts sort of in the last decade, how many cleaning adverts were there featuring men? It was, I think we'd had that initial push in the 80s, but it sort of slid backwards. And whilst a lot of people might think, oh, that's superficial, it doesn't mean anything, actually it does. From a very early age, we are told what our gender roles are, and it's very difficult to break out of them. And that goes for men as well as women. Men are not told that domestic chores are a valuable contribution to society that they need to engage in. And unfortunately, for the most part, it therefore becomes a domestic conversation at an individual level. And that's what we need to shift. We can't put that responsibility onto individual families and individual couples to sort this out. It has to be at a much bigger level.
Thanks, Ruth. And I know, Clodagh, it makes me think about the chamber actually, and the shift that you were talking earlier about the kind of collaborative nature of women business leaders in the area, and the chamber, I think it's fair to say, has come on a journey in the last couple of years, and you've been part of that. Can you share any lessons from that might be helpful for
without a shadow of a doubt? I mean, it's the chamber I would describe. If I look back at it when, 2015, when I was running a business down here and my team were trying to make me go to chamber events, I was kind of, it's a bit pale, male and stale, which, effectively what it was. And it was a networking organization that people would just go and have a bit of a chat and a bit of a lunch. And that was pretty much it. And then as I look, in terms of me getting involved locally with local activity and local initiatives to help drive the local economy forward, I mean, my big driver is because I've got 3 children, and in effect, I want my 9-year-old, when he's here at 23 years of age, after he's gone to university or gone away and come back, that he's got a choice that he can have a fulfilling career in this region. That's why not? Why does he need to? Why is there a view that you have to go to London, you have to go elsewhere? Why can't we have that in the Southwest if they choose to do that? And when I got the opportunity to become involved with the chamber, I took a conscious decision that actually, rather than being on the outside and thinking it wasn't a great organisation, why don't I actually, put my money where my mouth is and actually roll my sleeves up and get involved and get engaged? And I think that's the challenge we need to give to ourselves, because it's very easy to sit on the outside and throw stones or have conversations over a cup of coffee or a glass of wine around where things are failing. But fundamentally, whether it's small or whether it's big, it doesn't matter. It's about all of us making that step to make a bit of a change. And in the last 2 years, we fundamentally changed. So the chamber as a board was 100% male. And in the last 2.5 years, it has changed now. And I think we've now got roughly a 60-40 split. So actually we've gone more female, and we'll do some recruitment in the course of the next 6 months. And we will be not specific on gender, but actually we want more diversity, because we haven't got pale, male and stale, but we have got white. And we've got gender diversity, but we don't have any other diversity in there at all. So we need to make a step forward on that. And through the pandemic, effectively, we literally rolled our sleeves up, and we went from a board that was meeting once every 2 months for 2 hours to a board that was meeting twice a week. And that went from 12 or 14 people, actually it went down to 2 or 3 of us, who just said, fundamentally, there's a whole host of businesses out there that just need, whether that's somebody to pick up the phone and say, how are you doing and do you need some support, right the way through to actually, can we put some pressure on the council to get the grants out faster, or can we provide some networking activity so that these people who are stuck at home and really and truly weren't able to reach out, they didn't have the social networks, so needed some frameworks put in place to be able to help bring them together. So we've moved from being what would have been, I think, a bit of a gentleman's club to something that's much more relevant in the community. And that's, our whole mantra is, if we're not adding value, we shouldn't be here. So how are we going to add value? How are we going to make a difference? And we want to be able to, and I think this is, I don't know whether it's the female male thing, but right now at the moment, all of our conversations are pretty much, in terms of the day-to-day running of it, are all females. there's 5 of us on a call on a Monday morning and it's all females. And I don't know, I can't quite get my head around it. Is some of our mantra around actually we're there because we genuinely want to add value, and if it's not worth doing, then there's no point in doing it. There's no egos in there. It's just about actually, does this make a difference? Yes or no? If it does, let's keep going. And I can't quite figure out in my head whether actually that is pandemic related, and therefore being girls, we're just really efficient with our time, because actually we don't have a lot. And particularly when children are homeschooling, I don't know about everybody else in the call, but when children are homeschooling, my capacity during the day goes to about, roughly to 40%, and I'm working till midnight to catch up. Because actually I've got 2 kids either side of me, and they want stuff printed off, and I have a 4-year-old upstairs with my husband, and I'm very lucky he's at home as well. So actually we've shared the burden of the burden, which is an awful way to say it, but we've shared the workload in terms of our children and homeschooling. But it means that actually on those calls, we are incredibly efficient because we only have a half an hour. Let's crack through it. We all take our jobs or our actions and we go off and do it. Having corporate environments in the past, I've not always experienced that. I've experienced going to meetings and going away with actions, but I've always experienced where actually there's a group of people who potentially don't come back doing the actions. And I can't quite figure out in my head now whether that is a shift, whether it's a female-male thing, or whether it's a circumstance. Because whether it's actually, we are here where we are right now, and actually we all know we want to drive this forward. Our mantra is we want to leave it better than we found it. And we're volunteering to do this, so therefore we're in a different place. But I guess how do we take some of those nuggets and how do we pull those into how we work collaboratively and collectively and effectively going forward, and build on that confidence and that resilience that is there and that is building? Sorry, that was quite a long answer to your question.
No, that's really helpful, Clodagh. Thank you. And I think it's interesting that the Chamber and Inspiring Girls as 2 examples are volunteering, people giving time to the greater good. And I wonder how much of that will be part of what we all need to do over the next few years. I'm going to move us on to our last question, and hopefully be able to bring in a few more questions that people have been asking. And this is a really fundamental and I think incredibly important question for our region and for our country. So the question is, how can we make sure that we seize this moment to build a more diverse and inclusive approach to developing our businesses and our institutions in the future? And Ruth, I'm asking you to kick off on that one.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So I think what I'd like us to think about when answering that question is really to start thinking, and we've all talked about it already, mentioned aspects of this already, but really to think about the structural and institutional level challenges and opportunities that we face when we're building the future of work. I think, we've all said this infection has ravaged and devastated individuals, families and communities everywhere. But in addition to the health inequalities, its impact socially and economically has been asymmetric. It's exposed a number of inequalities for various different groups in society. And whilst obviously their existence is not a good thing, the opportunity now to acknowledge, accept and address them surely is a good thing. It's a good opportunity. So how do we do that? Well, I think my main point here would be to do it with purpose and intention, very clearly. Certainly I've worked quite a bit over the last 14 years with various aspects of government and big corporates and professional services firms, and latterly with the NHS. And whilst undoubtedly a part of the job is consistently to point out the lack of change or the lack of equality or sometimes the lack of understanding, actually there have been some really phenomenal successes over the past decade and change processes put in place. And what they all have in common, what the data shows, is that they didn't happen by wishful thinking. They happened by design. So I think that's kind of my key point. So in order to bring about change, organizations, whatever size, shape, form, need to have a strategy that's focused on systems. Diversity inclusion is no different. It's just a change process to design. Leaders need to decide what their goal is, proactively align their strategy with that. And as an academic, I would of course say this has to be evidence-based, and any organization shouldn't be making a start on this without really understanding their data, their people analytics. I think internally they need to have some sort of measurable time-bound objectives, and then from there work out appropriate interventions and make sure that this happens. And I think this is where a number of organisations fall short. There needs to be accountability. Go back to our point about the gender pay gap. If there's no accountability there, people don't do it. I think any policy or change to government or organisation needs to conduct a gender impact assessment, going back to Melanie's original point about sex disaggregated data. And indeed for public sector organisations, that's part of the public sector duty, although not to be political about it, one might say that this government appears to have slightly forgotten that in the last 12 months. But anyway, whatever diversity initiatives that at whatever organisational level you're thinking about, it must be based on data from that organisation, whether that's monitoring, hiring, promotion processes, engagement, culture. The basis of the intervention must be on the data. We recently did some work looking at the most diversified NHS trust boards, both in terms of gender and ethnicity, and interviewed some of the chairs of those boards to ascertain how they had achieved such high levels of diversity. So they were averaging around 47% female and 21% Black and Asian minority ethnic directors. And they all started with their organisational data, and then they put in place clear strategic aims to really achieve that true cognitive diversity that I think Clodagh was alluding to earlier around the board table, based on diversity of skills and characteristics and experience that are most pertinent to that organisation. I think another thing that we touched on earlier today, and I'm sure it's all a trope that you've heard of before, but businesses and career structures were designed by men for men in the early 20th century, because by and large, back then it was men who were building businesses and having careers. But given that we're in the third decade of the 21st century now, is it not time to dismantle some of those structures and systems that are not designed, specifically not designed to be equally accessible by both sexes? So on the one hand, I think, as we've heard, many women and men have been hugely challenged by lockdown circumstances of working from home with the enormous additional domestic labour and homeschooling, etc. Where they haven't been furloughed, this has caused many women to feel forced to resign from their jobs. I think that's one, we haven't touched on this, but that's one thing that we've really seen a lot happening during the lockdowns. And I think Sarah alluded to the piece in The Guardian this morning about women feeling like they're being pushed back to the 1970s, but women leaving their jobs in inverted commas voluntarily in order to manage their caring responsibilities. I saw one statistic last week, in fact, that the number of women currently registered by the ONS as economically inactive is 24%, and that's the highest it's ever been on record. However, and again, I think we've touched on it a little bit as well, I suppose the flip side of that coin is that when we come out of the worst of the pandemic, is that the whole world has learned that for many parts of many organisations, we can do things differently. We don't have to be in the office to be productive. We have changed the world of work so much in the last 11, 12 months in ways that we would have said were not possible, in such a short period of time, that I think that offers us so much opportunity to think, okay, so what else do we want to change and how do we want to create a new norm, both for organisations and individuals? Now's the opportunity to try and create more agile, hybrid ways of working for everyone. That so that you don't have to, it doesn't have to entail a daily long commute if that's your bugbear, or really poor work-life balance. But it must be structured so that people still can be together in predictable ways for parts of the work that is interdependent. We can't just say, okay, anyone can work however flexibly they want. And that's often been one of the challenges in the past of people trying to work flexibly, is that managers haven't managed it. So that does need to be managed with purpose and intention. But again, it needs to be led by the organisation, needs to be designed into the way that teams are created and they function, and needs to be role modelled by leaders and supported by internal structures and systems.
Fantastic. Thank you. Super helpful and super useful. Melanie, I just wonder, with your perspective from an NHS, you've got a role across the NHS and you're based, within Devon at the Partnership Trust. The South West is not known for its diversity, frankly. What's your take on where the South West can get to from a kind of NHS perspective in terms of really embedding the sorts of things that Ruth is talking about?
Yeah, so I think one of the really interesting things that's happened, I know Ruth's been involved across the NHS, is a new discussion about inequality and diversity, which actually, for all understandable reasons, has primarily been focused about the inequality for people or staff, I'm talking about now, from staff from Black or Asian or other minority ethnic backgrounds. And it's undoubtedly so that the discrimination, and it is discrimination that's institutionalised in the NHS around that, is profound and incredibly damaging. So that discussion has changed, and there is definitely a push to have a different discussion about diversity, inclusion more generally. Ruth's work's been really influential in that. I think so that's to the good. I think what's absolutely clear is, as Ruth said, that it is starting, I can't remember the exact phrase, Ruth, but with intent and purpose is my phrase around that, and not being afraid of that. People get very anxious about that. And I find that fascinating, because if you flip to the delivery of care side, what we know is we always prioritise people who need whatever it is most. So why wouldn't we apply that very simple principle in terms of care? Anyway, that's how we do, and we know why. There's whole social constructs around that. So I think there is a real challenge around that. I think the real challenge is how we in the South West actually address diversity in our context. So we're not, so I've worked previously in Inner London. We're not Inner London. That's a very different dialogue. In many ways, I would argue it was much easier in those jobs to address inequality, because the inequality was about, certainly where I work, the majority, not the minority. And that was so stark that we didn't sort it, just to be clear, but we did make progress. Whereas I think there's something quite different down here. But nevertheless, in the South West, just like the whole of the NHS, the significant majority of the workforce is female, but the stratification of that workforce is the more senior roles have more men in them, the roles that are given more social value are more likely to have men in. So it's not just about salary, although there is definitely a salary increase. So actually, if we go back to our earlier discussion about what's the new ask, the new challenge, and I was thinking when I think it was Sarah was saying about 50 years ago, her mum couldn't have had a mortgage. It reminded me of, so I'm obviously a bit older than Sarah, but I can really clearly remember in 1975, my mum coming home. She decided to do some voluntary work with the Citizens Advice Bureau, and she came home with a book that was about the Sex Discrimination Act, and how excited she was about that, and how revolutionary it was, and how I can even remember the picture of the cover. It had Superwoman on the cover. My father, who actually, in his defense, he's done it, but was one of the great unspoken female allies, and he just rolled his eyes and went, "Oh God, not more Superwoman stuff," in a very generous way. But actually, if you think about those words like recovery, restoration, the real and very genuine and understandable anxiety about going back, actually there is an opportunity, isn't there, for an energy and an excitement of that and a modernising of that. So, we all sit on the shoulders of the women who came before us and the men who supported them. So the suffragettes succeeded because of a range of reasons, including that they had male allies. I always say that the two biggest feminist supporters I have had was my father and my husband, and neither of them would define themselves as feminists, but they absolutely, and I'm sure others have their equivalents of that. So actually, rather than us be in battle, let's work as allies, because to Clodagh's point, the collaboration we have and those men that want to collaborate, which actually I suspect is many, many more than we appreciate and recognise, because we get into these very polarised discussions about all women are great, men are toxic. And actually, as a mother of a son, I found that increasingly uncomfortable over the last few years. And I'm sure that's partly virtually him moving from a child to a young man. But actually, I don't want a world in which women are good and men are bad. I don't. One of his stories is how difficult, he's very into the arts and humanities and loves poetry. And, the abuse he got for that in his previous school, he's changed schools, but in his previous school, because it was, I won't repeat it, but you can imagine the sort of the effeminizing of that, as if having feminine qualities as they're perceived as a man is a bad thing. And we want, just as well as we want to raise great women, we want to raise great men, and actually we want to raise great humans. And that's about, I think we could really align against and stop the polarised conversation. And maybe that's the thing we really need, because if we set with purpose, exactly as Ruth says, and not just we want to do better, that we want to do better and it looks like this, then and it wasn't intentional, but I'm very minded on the backdrop that I put up, just so you can't see how untidy my study is, frankly. That's an old slide, but I think there is something about how do we move with purpose. I absolutely align with what Ruth was saying around that.
Thanks, Melanie. As a woman, I've got two daughters, but it's my husband that's done all of the homeschooling, and it's my husband that does all of the cooking, because I'm the one that does most of the working, and that's just the way it is. And I'm very lucky in the sense. I'm conscious of time, and we could definitely go on for a long time. But
Ciara, can I just, in the spirit of choose to challenge, I know you want to finish, so I'm going to just challenge you on that word lucky. So I have a husband who is a home dad, thank God, because there'd be some state intervention otherwise. But people say to me, "You're very lucky," and I'm lucky to have married my husband, but actually that stuff that you have, and I suspect a number of us have, and a number of the women watching have, and many of the men, it isn't luck.
No,
we have to own the choices we make to be positive too. I don't want to personalise that too much.
No, I think it's a really
phrase.
Good.
It's one of my hobby horses.
It's a great challenge, and in fact, it's not one that I wouldn't normally say that. So it's really interesting. So thank you for picking me up on that, Sawsan.
I'm going to also grab a challenge and throw it out into the air here. I've loved the discussion, and everybody's touched on really core points about gender and today's International Women's Day, and so that's quite correct. A bunch of times the ethnic minorities have come into the discussion, and the word diversity in its wider scope, and inclusion in its wider scope. And I feel I need to mention that it's from a diverse ethnic women perspective. I'm the one whose name never gets called in Zoom calls because nobody knows how to pronounce it, and everybody's walking on eggshells and afraid to insult me if they mispronounce my name. So I never get called, or I left all the way to the end. I'm the one that looked at boards, women on boards, and I joined the women on boards thing, and I'm looking for a board to join, but I look at who else is on these boards and they're all white, and I'm like, that's not my people. I don't know what I might bring to that conversation. I don't know if I'll be heard if I was to bring something to that conversation. And so, and I don't want to be brought in because I'm diverse. I want to be brought in because somebody thinks I've got something useful to say and do on that board. And so one, we have to kind of bring those elements into these conversations as well when we talk about this grander diversity, across the whole board.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sawsan. I really appreciate that. And I what I think is so interesting is that we've got to the last 5 minutes and we've started 2 really good challenges. So it's been really lovely and collaborative. And then we've got to the stage of kind of being actually challenging each other. So no, it's terrific. And totally, utterly with you, Sawsan. And I think there is a lot more. There's a huge amount more for the business school, for the university, and for all of our institutions across the Southwest to treat this subject with the attention that it needs, and there is a long way to go, and we're all part of making that happen. With that in mind, what I want to do is a very quick whip round everybody, because I think something that you said, Sawsan, earlier has got people, that call to arms that you put out earlier about actually what are we going to do. So I'm going to go around to each of you and say, and I literally want to lie, but on the back of today, all of the people that are on this call, men and women, what are the actual things that they can do? So is that about inspiring girls? Is it about joining the chamber? I don't know, but tell us from your own perspectives, what's the one thing that people coming off this call today could do to follow up and make this the best International Women's Day we can have for this particular moment? So Sawsan, you go first.
I'm going to start. Everybody on this call, and at the moment there's 84 people here, listen more. Listen with the intent of actually hearing what the other person is saying, be they your child, be they your son, your daughter, your husband, your partner, your spouse, your neighbor, male, female, old and young. Listen to hear, not just listen because, oh yeah, I'm sitting here and I can't help. No, listen. And I think if we listen more, we'll have much more engaging, collaborative, equal conversations all around.
Thank you. Who's next?
I think there's, for me, there's actually 2 things, if I may. So I'll challenge you on the one. Firstly, I think that I would really implore everyone to build their empathy skills, because I think going forward into the future, it's going to be one of the key skills from leadership all the way down to individual level. That certainly is going to be absolutely key to make sure that we have the future that we want to have. Secondly, obviously, as a plug for Inspiring Girls, anybody who would like to sign up and actually give some voluntary time to really help the future of our region is going to be absolutely fantastic. Thank you.
And where can people find out more information, Sarah?
You can find out through LinkedIn, through the page, or by all means contact directly for me or the Exeter City Council. Thank you.
I'll go next. I think it's shouting out to, I'm going to focus on International Women's Day. It's shouting out to females who are in your life, whether that's just simply giving them a bit of positive feedback and saying actually they're doing a good job and picking out stuff that actually they're doing well, or whether that's more vocally through LinkedIn or other platforms that are there. I think we need to champion and really need to call out all of the positive stuff that's going on out there. That would be my one.
Thanks, Clodagh.
This is not a well-formed thought, but it's something around challenging gender stereotypes for both men and women. So whether that's, if I have 2 teenagers, one's a girl, one's a boy, if you're raising kids, just be really careful about some of the wording that is common parlance that we use, like, run like a girl, or those sort of really damaging expressions that are just part of our normal society. Think about what it is, what the message you're giving as you say them, and then also I think just really encouraging young boys and young men as to how they can express their gender, and that they have just a broad, that they don't have to be this sort of hyper masculine horrible stereotype that we have. So not horrible stereotype, but really narrow stereotype that we have about what a young man can be. because, you know, as I think certainly Melanie and a few other people have said, you know, we need men to be feminine and we need women to be masculine. If we're using those adjectives in terms of the sort of the traits and actions that we ascribe to those two sexes. So just allowing that conversation, particularly with young people, around what does it mean to be female, what does it mean to be male, what does it mean to be masculine, what does it mean to be feminine, and that is all okay.
Thanks, Ruth. And your last insight, Melanie?
So I'm going to cheat and use other people. So I think it's what Sawsan said about listening. I'm sorry, I can't remember your exact words, but with empathy and thoughtfully, to then use Ruth's words, which was about working with purpose and intent, because it's very easy to start off on a journey thinking you know, but just listening isn't enough. So putting those two together, and if we all did that and kept that sort of guiding light of it serves us all well to make reduce that inequality gap, whoever we are, then that would be the big take home.
Thank you. Thanks very much to all our panel. Thanks for everybody for joining us. I'm a stickler for finishing on time, so it will annoy me that we've gone 1 minute over, but we've had such a great afternoon. You know, huge thanks to all of you speakers for joining us and for everybody for coming. I do want to just give a special shout out to Lois and particularly Charlotte, who are behind the scenes, who helped with this. Two brilliant young women that Charlotte's made my life so much easier over the past year, and I've never properly thanked her enough. So thank you, Charlotte. It seems right to do that on International Women's Day, especially when she's going on to a great new job. So thank you to Charlotte. So this is our first Women in Business event for this year. Really welcome your thoughts and suggestions on topics and speakers you'd like to see. I'm sorry I didn't get to all of the questions that people had. Some great questions there, and you know, I did read all of them, and thank you so much. We do have our new series of leading edge talks coming up. The first one starts on the 22nd of March. Matt Peacock, a brilliant man, talking about being a vulnerable leader, working in arts and homelessness. He's going to be an absolutely terrific speaker. It's 45 minutes over lunch. Come and hear his leadership journey. But on that note, thank you all for joining us, and have a great International Women's Day.